Hi, everybody, and welcome to Precog time number 36, our last Precog time for the summer and maybe ever. No, just teasing, but maybe ever on Zoom. Um,
Yeah.
and we're really so happy to be closing this out with one of our favorite artists, Lily Jue Sheng, who collaborated with us and contributed to Precog issue 4 with an amazing piece about map projections in a video. And so we're just really lucky and happy to be talking with Lily today. Lily is a moving image artist working across film, animation, collage, text, performance, and 2D mixed media. They were born in Shanghai, China, and raised in New Jersey, and studied at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Massachusetts. Their work has recently been presented by Mono No Aware and the Poetry Project in New York City. Their work has been shown locally, nationally, and internationally, including at Roulette Intermedium, Art Book at MoMA PS1, the Knockdown Center, and Outpost Artist Resources in New York City, Lightfield Festival in San Francisco, Images Festival, Winnipeg Underground Festival, and Cinecycle in Canada, and TCAC, Taipei Contemporary Art Center in Taiwan. So we'll start this the way we started all of these by asking you, Lily, what your quarantine has been like, and how you've been and how it's affected your studio.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Gabby, Flo, and Kelly for inviting me to end out the Precog times for the summer. And yeah, I'm happy to be here. I haven't really done I haven't done a virtual talk. So it's good practice. And I mean, I don't know that I really want to sum up the last year and a half, but the bulk of my day-to-day, my priorities, my interests, and how I've been choosing to spend my time it's pretty different. Um, that's been pretty gradual, like, and way before the pandemic started, but in these sort of waves. And yeah, I think the things that have impacted me the most are, well, work and what I do, or what I basically don't do for a living, and the things I've chosen to take on in responsibilities in my family life. So I have sort of become a informal caretaker of sorts for one of my parents. And in a nutshell, I mean, my scenario is that I I don't have any siblings. My parents are the relatives that I have in this country, and they're both seniors. They they aren't together, so they live alone, and they aren't working jobs. And one of them has just had a lot to deal with in transitioning there. So I've kind of come into that, and it is a lot, but I also say that to sort of set up this kind of world that I've been in, where I just don't really subscribe to the kind of compartmentalizing of what I consider, like what people consider studio space, or what people consider as making work or creative output. And that's a little bit of the sass in my title of Make No Work, in that making no work is really making work.
Mm. And so I know that your most recent project and something that you're working on now is related to Ikebana, which is Japanese, traditional Japanese flower arranging form. So I wonder if you could, in light of the introduction and description that you just gave, if you could talk a little bit about that project in relationship to your life in this case, which is your work. and vice versa. And then we can sort of look at the work.
Yeah. The Ikebana film, the start of that project was a while ago. The conversation started at the very end, but the end of 2018. And I had been in the production part of it in the bulk of 2019. And um, it's been a long collaboration and a long distance collaboration that has also mostly been remote. I was invited by my friend and to make animations for it. And I was very interested in the subject and the film concept that she had described to me, and was up for the challenge of trying to translate animation into Ikebana. I don't think any of us imagined the timeline that it's taken or the number of directions it's gone in since in the edit room, but we are done and I'm here now and I'm very happy about that. And as far as like a bit of my world of thinking around it now that I've had some time and distance, I feel this film is a very clear example to me of our collaborating and working through issues of different binaries, trying to move out of different binaries in our subject treatment, in our collective authorship, and in our collaborating. And in the sense that like Ikebana and the roles that we've had in making it, like this isn't a work I feel really belongs to me. And I also don't feel like it's a work that fully belongs to Rita or say, you know, the arranging school Segetsu, Sofu Teshigahara. I don't really feel like it belongs to him either, or the women who appear in the film, but it's kind of all of our hand. And the film, in the way that we present the writing, our voice, our sound, and the combination of image and sound is very much about that. And our 2 years of this has very much been a kind of journey in figuring out what we are basically not trying to explain. Yeah.
Amazing. So this is a still, and we'll watch the clip.
When creating a variety of natural scenes, one can imagine moonlight, feeling the wind moving across, and hearing the sounds of insects when finding a disfigured leaf. Incorporating the path that the plant has had, where it emerged, and how it grew.
Thus, we see something invisible, and we hear something inaudible. most essential spirit of arranging
should be based on the beauty of the original impression given to us by each plant.
the original impression does not mean shape or form of the real entity, but rather the ideal image of the plant, including the history of its life.
So that's just I think a 2-minute clip. The film is pretty short. It's 13 minutes. And this is the bulk of the animation portion that I had worked on. If you actually want to go to the next slide, I had written out some of the dialogue that is spoken by this author. And a lot of the texts that we are reading are also references from books that we have kind of made a collage of as well. And if you go to some of the next slides, I can talk a little bit about more of the material. I had made these animations all in cut paper, and these are, I recently have also like fixed some of these pieces. So this is actually the backside of a collage. I've been experimenting with sort of making double-sided collages as the sort of technique that's happening as far as using positive and negative shapes and overlapping them, and using these various animation techniques such as replacement method and silhouette and multiplane. They create this sort of dimension and a kind of somatics and movement within animation as a way to translate movement and this concept of 5 movements that I've worked with before in my previous work, which it's hard to concisely describe, but I would say it's a kind of ontology. It's a set of archetypes, elements, and movements that are present in traditional Chinese medicine, typically. And these elements, which for this piece were Godai, or earth, water, fire, wind, and void. In the animation you had just seen, those are sort of represented in both the sort of magical imagery and the way that the movements are happening and the way that they kind of transition into each other. Yeah, and some of these, like the last few here, they're on the larger side. And while you may recognize snippets of these from, you know, very short clip that you watched, these look so much different because of the way the scale is 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 completely different when you're working in stop motion.
It also makes me think about your interest in text and poetry. It sounds like, especially in this piece, and even the way that you framed it, looking at the animation, talking about the collaged sections from literature, and then thinking about different kinds of archetypes or elements, that ideas about poetics are an important part of thinking about collage. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about poetry, yeah, and how it influences your work, and whether it influences your work.
Yeah, I would actually say as far as poetry or writing or literature, I think in a way, I do make poetry as a result of films. But yeah, it's kind of like the effect of making films. I do read some poetry now, but these days I'm a little less meta of like, I look at films to be inspired by films, or I look at poetry to be inspired by poetry. I tend to read more, I read more fiction, speculative fiction, translated fiction. I've been in a bunch of reading groups, which are more on the political study side. And while you might not necessarily draw that one-to-one kind of conclusion, I think I'm more interested in how that kind of maps onto a subject like flowers. And with poetry, the why of poetry, it has a lot to do with my relationship to languages and my relationship or lack of relationship to placehood. I am very much interested in playing with language. I speak Shanghainese. I also speak Mandarin, but I mostly speak Shanghainese, and that's a dialect of Mandarin that is, I mean, really any dialect of any language is not so much fixed, and that allows for this kind of flexibility and playfulness and a kind of like rebellion, maybe not rebellion, a kind of resistance to the sort of like hegemony of more official state languages. And I end up making poetry in the ways I express it, both through its oral expression and using and misusing it in written expressions. And it often ends up being something that becomes very illegible because of the sort of audience I'm usually presenting it to. Yeah. This is the photo that Gabby just had up was, this was from last year, and it's a installation view of a piece called Change, Bien, which is a 6-minute, 16mm double projection that is all just Chinese characters and my speaking it. And yeah, I mean, that piece has a whole explanation around it. I don't know that I want to get into it today, but
Maybe we could
yeah.
watch a little bit of the 5 elements.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Uh,
Put it up here.
maybe since I was just talking about dialect, if you want to play the poetry project audio, it would give people a sense of what I'm saying. Yeah.
一只小方块坐了只大方块高头，小方块是一个小房间，里向有一个床，一个窗子，一个门。大方块是一个饭店，饭店生意老好的，里向有老多客人。小房间里有2人，搿2个人辣海比戏法。饭店的客人能够看搿个2个人，但是伊拉是搞勿清爽搿2个人来做啥。客人要是必须看、必须听，伊拉会得发觉小房间跟饭店是没第4个墙壁。
And you want to go to the slide right after that?
Sure.
The one, yeah, that one. Just to give you a sense of what I mean by unfixed. I mean, I feel during that particular performance and at the time I started, I code switched. I also kind of did this thing where I broke the fourth wall and talk directly to the audience. Sorry, I have a little bit of and I started signing as a way to sort of engage where people have lost a sense of place in like direct translation. And in this slide, we have these 2 words, which are bu and de, or va and a, where all like the 2 to the left, which are bolded, are how they're typically written in Mandarin. And all of the characters and romanizations in quotations are ways in which you can write it in dialect, and none of them are really wrong or right. Some of them are used more often than others because of the way people have like popularized it, especially on the internet and through texting. But yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a sort of fungibility I'm really interested in. There's this way in which oral tradition is so rich in storytelling, and you won't find it in books. I mean, oral tradition is literally like the passing of it in generation to generation through the ways in which you speak to the people you have relationships with. So all of that is sort of my interest now in developing a project around Shanghainese language.
Lily, is that also the way that you talk about dialect and speech and orality, as we were talking about it this weekend, also seems to have a relationship in perhaps an earlier interest of yours in experimental music, which may have a similar kind of non-homogeneity and non-fixedness in terms of form and structure. We don't have to spend too much time on it, and also just because sound features so prominently in your work, I was wondering if you could talk about that as well.
Yeah. I feel like the sound aspect of work, or the sort of musical and sound influence, really comes from a bit of a personal and very like intuitive space, where really in my coming of age, in my teens and in my 20s, I mean, I've definitely been generative. I've been generative in visual art forms for as long as I can remember, and predominantly in those forms. But yeah, in my coming of age, I was much more exposed to, and I just socialized a lot in these different music subcultures. And I've gone to a lot of live shows. I've had this interest in synthesized sounds, and I never quite took it to a place of like getting serious about an instrument or like doing the band thing. But I feel as though the way in which sound functions, it's really like deep in your body or deep in your bones. And that's a feeling I try to embed in my treatment for film. Because yeah, there's a way, again, to a sense of like the somatic. Sound really, and like the community around music, it's this sort of space where you like kind of get to know everyone, and you have this like communal experience. You can also like be as social or unsocial, antisocial as you like, but it's this like very embodied feeling. And a lot of my work, I think, has that kind of spirit to it.
Flo, did you have a question?
Oh, no. I was thinking maybe we should watch another clip.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Lily, the 5 movements clip is 12, correct?
Oh yeah, so I can kind of preface this a little bit. This was a performance from Roulette, where, so also with this particular piece, 5 movements, I collaborated with my friends and artists, Anjali Rathod and Niall Genevieve Kim Kaliski, who were part of the production, or Anjali's paintings are featured prominently in the film. And I worked with Niall on the music scores, and we've done a couple live performances together. She was also a part of the poetry project performance. And here, this piece is always different when it's performed. And this was a version we had done that involved a lot of projection performance and spoken word. So yeah.
As soon as you want it to play, it refuses. Let me just go up one slide and come back. Sorry, I think my keynote may have frozen. So I'm gonna, okay, we're back.
Well, I can talk about these images too. This was from the still images. They were from, they were sort of one.
Lily, we can hear that. Oh, it just broke out for a second.
Technology is not cooperating.
Technology is not cooperating. Can people hear me?
I'm gonna stop the share for a second.
Can people hear me?
Now we can. Give me a second. And to let the computer like get its bearings, you know. Okay. I'll go back. I'll see if the clip will work.
You gotta try again.
Yeah, we're trying again. All right, let's see.
Yeah, I had really adapted that performance for the space that it was in, and trying to incorporate a bit of the architecture and sort of thinking about projection and spatial projection. And there was definitely a time of my work in those couple years where I had been doing a lot of live projection performance.
Lily, can you talk about the films that you're influenced by, and also what it's like to you work at Anthology and what it's like to be working in that archive?
So yeah, I had kind of come into doing this job. It was like a finite one where I had come on to digitize and catalog all of their small gauge films. And I'm like, the theater is not open, but I do still sometimes work in the box office. But as far as like that world of film archiving, it's definitely it introduced me into a lot of like artists' full repertoire. And there, I had put these two quotes. One was from Stone Soko, who was actually the sort of reason I kind of came on to that job, was to catalog all of his films. Um, he was also a former employee of the Anthology Film Archives in also working in the box office, but being a part of the community at the time and kind of a generation before me. And I, these two, both these two filmmakers and the things that they're saying in these quotes, they're very different. Their work is very different. Their whole vibe is very different, but they do resonate in this way about really resisting a kind of expectation to say something, and to say something in terms of a kind of drama, a kind of didacticness that people anticipate around films that really kind of inspire my way of thinking around films. And I've definitely gone back and forth a bit on whether that's like a form of resisting categorization that's meaningful, or if it's a little bit indulgent to ask of viewers. I think it's maybe a bit of A and B. But I mean, ultimately, I feel in the spirit of like, I don't really care, and I don't really expect to kind of have critical mass around filmmaking. So I feel very much in community with what they're saying.
Mm. Something that we've been thinking about, especially in relationship to those quotes, had to do with also how images function, and obviously in film also the reliance on image, I mean, to communicate. It's moving image, but and so I was wondering if you could talk about, or like both of those quotes end up talking about aesthetics as a more precise form of communication than language in a certain way, or how are stories are told and not told simultaneously. And I was wondering if you could think about, or if you could talk a little bit about how you think about image, because you have such a strong aesthetic sensibility, and I think the function of imaging is a long-term investment in your work, both, you know, going back to your project in Precog around mapping and the function of different kinds of projections in map making, but I think also in terms of how you literally arrange or collage, and how you frame in your films.
Yeah. Images and movement, like moving images. I think they function in a much more direct way for me, and in a way that like in the time it takes me to describe something, and in the way that language is sort of restricted. I feel like images get a lot across immediately in a way without having to kind of do all of this contextualization. And it it made me think of this Changyu, and Changyu is, in a sense, these 4-character Chinese idioms, which mostly, in my experience, old people tell you to test your patience. And the one I'm thinking of goes, open door, see mountain, 开门见山, which my elder has said to me that it only really is a euphemism for get to the point. But I also feel as though like a mountain is this vast thing. It's big, it's full of wildlife. It has all these details, and it's more of on the like a picture's worth 1,000 words kind of deal. And so that's sort of like what I think about in terms of image making. Like there's so many things that it encompasses that you just don't have to like do all this dancing around.
Also, if anyone has any questions, now's the time to send them over. And we can, have like a little question and answer before we wrap up.
I also wanted to, while people are writing in questions, make sure to get to ask you, Lily, about sort of to circle back to what you were talking about early on in the talk around not having a studio, a traditional separate studio, and also not making hard line distinctions between the parts of your life that belong to art and the parts of your life that are outside of that. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how art happens for you, and like what that movement is like. And I was just going to move through some of the early slides in your presentation as well.
I feel really excited because, like, one, in the sense of the pandemic happening and it changing most people's lives, like, I feel very relieved that I don't have to do the sort of dancing around, having a timeline, having this output that's anticipated, having to do public facing things in concrete ways, and not having to like go to all this shit. It's great. And I feel very fortunate too, because I am doing this 2-year fellowship, and it's giving me the support and the time and space to really develop my thinking, my worlds of thinking. And that's sort of where I feel a lot of things are stirring the pot. And I don't really know what it is, but I do know, like, I learned to garden last year. I've been growing food in my yard. I feel, in a way, it is a kind of response to taking my time back and to integrating a kind of labor that we're very alienated from in the way that our, so-called intellectual spaces keep us tied to technologies like the one we're using now. So it's a bit of like integration there. And I also volunteer my time through different movements to try and figure out what speaks to me and how it sort of informs thinking on my feet and thinking and being present. And I've also had time to do reading. I mean, 2 years ago when I've always been a bit of a weird freelancer, but I had been very much a part of the like nonprofit industrial complex as a very underpaid administrative worker. And yeah, you don't have time to read when you're in an environment like that. And these are the things that I am kind of cultivating rather than like trying to get to an answer right away. And that feels exciting to me.
Anna wanted to know what's on your reading list.
Right now, I'm in the middle of these two texts. One just came out and I'm realizing, I don't know if it's come out. I think the person that's leading our group has a preview copy, but it's called On Property by Ronaldo Walcott. And it's this very, I find it's this very accessible writing in a refreshing way, where he talks about a kind of historical material analysis of Black radical abolitionist movements and the sort of logic, the plantation logic and the context of property through the prison industrial complex and policing and law. And I like it too because it is a Canadian context. And as a kind of American, I often feel as though I don't have as much of that perspective. So that's really nice. And I've been doing this close reading with a friend with a text by He Ying-zhen, who I'm more familiar with as I started reading that last year, the text is called On the Revenge of Women. It has a great title. And she is this kind of 20th century anarchist who's come of the Tokyo camp of Chinese anarchists of that time. And her writing is more academic or dense, but it's also very emotional. It's very thorough and it's very critical. I mean, she's almost a kind of outsider within her own group in terms of how thorough and obsessive she gets, kind of pointing out the hegemonies of language in Chinese, in Confucianism, and in combining worlds of feminism, Marxism, and anarchism. So yeah, those are really influential. That she's really influential in my sort of thinking right now.
Could you repeat the title of the first book?
On Property.
On Property? Okay.
Ronaldo Walcott.
And we have another question from Nancy, who says, I may have gotten the name wrong here, but I wanted to at least drop it in the chat. Nancy says, I'm very curious to understand the nature of your collaboration. I don't mean that it's prescribed, but more what you're giving to each other. She really enjoys the work and would need to see more to understand, but also has another small question about what you meant by didacticism of the cinema references that you mentioned.
In the context of Ikebana, like if I were to have to categorize that film, I'd say it's an experimental documentary. And in the sort of categorization of documentary, there are these expectations around addressing, a central character or the development of your interest in this character. And to be frank, most of my films just don't have people in them. And in that sense, I feel like I'm sort of against centering the human. I'm more interested in Ikebana. I feel my seeing of contribution relates to like calling, I mean, I wouldn't say it's that scientific, but in a sense, like I'm more interested in these interspecies relations than centering the human in film or centering like specific social struggles that point to making a sort of exceptionalism for the filmmaker to be saying something, for the filmmaker to be triumphing over a particular struggle, and to also like I mean, it's very hard to like incorporate that in the way that you collaborate as well as the story, because there's just so many elements going on. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but in collaboration, I mean, I started out as the animator for the film, and I've also come to get into the voiceover. I had pretty much made notes for every edit of the film. I commented on the music. I have had like hundreds of phone calls about this film. So it's really close working together. And it's a scenario where I haven't worked with Rita, and I came out of the other end with entirely different ideas than what I came in with. And I mean, you could say a lot of collaborations are like that, but oftentimes, I guess what I mean is all of my collaborations are different, and I don't necessarily work with the same people, and I don't necessarily want to do the same thing over again or like repeat a kind of formula in it. So yeah, it's kind of a lot to juggle. And it's not to say I think collaboration is better, but I do feel as though it challenges you in a way that's different than being isolated and alone all the time, not really sharing your thoughts as much with another person.
Lily, are you working on anything new right now?
I'm thinking about it. Yeah, I think it's pretty early. I have been pretty much doing a lot of reading, research, journaling. I'm very interested in self-publishing something at some point that is maybe, again, if I had to categorize it, maybe in the realm of like an artist book, but I haven't been like putting that to paper just quite yet, other than just journal notes.
Amazing. Well, I think that's a really good place to end the formal part of tonight's talk. So thank you so much, Lily, for joining us.